Today I'm going to step through the procedure for replacing the piston and or the piston rings on your Polaris 2-stroke ATV. Now we're going to be using a Polaris 250 engine to demonstrate this, but the procedure is the same on all the Polaris 2-stroke engines. The only special tool required is a torque wrench for torquing down the bolts on the cylinder jug and on the cylinder head. Now, if you have a larger torque wrench that measures in foot-pounds, it's about 18 to 20 foot-pounds. These smaller wrenches that measure in inch-pounds, it's about 240 inch-pounds. Now, in this case, we have the engine out and on the workbench, but that's not required. You can just remove the plastic around the top here, remove 2 bolts that holds the tank in place, and then slide it back so that you can get access to the cylinder head and the cylinder jug. So let's go ahead and get started. If the engine is still in the frame, you'll need to remove the exhaust pipe and the carburetor because the cylinder jug will be coming off. The first step is to get a 12mm socket and remove the 6 nuts that hold the head onto the engine. Now in this case I've already removed the 6 nuts. It should come off fairly easy, but if you have a problem you can lightly tap on it with a rubber mallet to kind of loosen things up. Now the next step is to remove the 4 bolts, 2 on each side, or I should say the 4 nuts, to remove the cylinder jug. Now again I've taken those off except for this one. You will be using a 15mm wrench to remove those nuts. And again you can tap this lightly depending upon who put the head back on to remove the cylinder jug. Now you can take a look at the cylinder and the piston and decide what needs to be done next. The most common reason for pulling your engine apart and replacing the piston is due to low compression. It could be caused by several things. One is if the engine was running without lubrication, it's going to score up the cylinder walls. Or 2, you did a compression test. The Polaris manual says once you get down to about 115 psi, you need to service the engine, put new rings on, or replace the piston. A lot of guys will go down to maybe even 105 psi before they bother. But the real test is to measure the skirt here with a feeler gauge. You can put the cylinder jug back on and then on the skirt on the back here you take your feeler gauge and measure the amount of space between the cylinder wall and the piston. If that space is somewhere around 5/1000ths or 6/1000ths of an inch, you'll need to replace the piston, even if the cylinder looks pretty good. A lot of times they'll just recommend anytime the compression gets low, you go ahead and do a fresh bore on the cylinder anyway, just to get everything squared up. So, your choice. But we'll show you next how to remove the piston. To remove the piston, you'll need to remove the circlips that are up inside here that hold the wrist pin in place. They're kind of hard to get at, but there is a little groove here. If you take something sharp like an awl, run it down this groove, you can pick at that circlip until you get it down where it's out of the groove, and then take a pair of needle nose pliers and pull it out. You won't be reusing these because your new piston will come with new circlips and a new wrist pin. Once you remove both, now I've already removed the circlip from the other side, you can take a flat blade screwdriver and to remove. And of course it'll move around on you the whole time. To have that wrist pin out. You also have your needle bearing for your connecting rod. You may or may not have one of these with your new piston, so keep track of it. If you're thinking of just replacing the piston rings on your piston, then obviously there's no reason to remove it. But the issue you typically run into, especially if this is an ATV that you bought used, is you don't know what size the piston is. It may have been bored once, maybe twice, and you really don't have any clear indication on the piston what brand it is or what rings you need to install. So if there's any doubt, the best thing to do is take the cylinder jug down to a machine shop that specializes in boring cylinder jugs. Get it bored to a known size with a fresh bore. You'll be much better off than trying to guess at what piston rings need to go in here. Before we install the piston, we want to make sure that all the surfaces on our cylinder jug and on the cylinder head are all clean. You shouldn't have any residue left from the gasket, or sometimes people use some type of sealant here. To clean these up, you need to use some type of a blade. What I recommend is take a little bit of like carb cleaner or brake cleaner, spray it on here, and it acts as a lubricant so that you're not scratching the aluminum with the blade, and also it kind of softens the material, so as you rub on here it comes off a lot easier. And when you're done, you'll get a nice clean shiny surface like this. You're ready for reinstalling the cylinder jug and the cylinder head. Piston options. When you take your cylinder jug into the machine shop to get it bored out, they'll measure it and then they'll recommend a piston size, usually maybe 0.5 millimeter or millimeter over the stock piston size. Anyway, you'll typically get two options. One is to go with a kit. Nomura seems to be a popular brand right now. It comes with everything you need, including the gaskets. You get this and you're ready to go. Second option is to go with a Wiseco piston. Sometimes if the cylinder's been bored multiple times, the only available piston size is a Wiseco. Now, the Wiseco is a stronger piston, but it is a little more finicky. You do have to let the ATV warm up a little bit before you take off. So they'll frequently just recommend the Nomura piston. If you're not ordering the piston through the machine shop, then you'll have to order it in and then give them the piston so that they can size the bore to match the piston that you're going to be using. They want it to be a perfect fit. Once you get your cylinder back from the machine shop, you want to open up your piston kit, inspect it, make sure everything is there. You also want to check your piston ring gap. Now frequently the machine shop will go ahead and do this for you. They will go ahead and take and verify that the gap there matches the specs for the cylinder. In the case of a Polaris 250, you want 0.12 of an inch gap here. Now if they haven't done this, you'll have to do it. So you take the ring, fit it into the cylinder, and then use the piston to kind of square things up, and then measure the end gap. In this case, ensure that it's 0.12. If it's too tight, you need to take a small file a little bit of material off, and then check it again. Once this ring is correct, you'll need to do the same thing to the second ring. So then you're ready to put the rings on the piston. Installing your piston rings takes a little bit of patience. Now on the two-stroke engines, typically there's no up or down orientation on these. You just take the piston ring, fit it into the groove, And then you just kind of work it, expand it until it snaps in. You want to do this slowly. You don't want to break the piston ring. And then once you get it in the first groove, you want to take that ring and move it down to the second groove, which is typically a little tricky. Need something to kind of push it back out so you can get it to work down. Okay, so we have the first one on. Then do the same thing with the second ring. Get it in. Just carefully work it around until you have them on. Before installing your piston, you want to make sure that your needle bearings and your wrist pin are well lubricated. Best method I've found is just get a small shop towel, take a clean screwdriver, dip it into 2-stroke oil, and then just kind of drizzle it on the bearing. And then onto the wrist pin. Set those aside for the moment. Now, when you look at your piston, all the 2-stroke pistons typically go in a certain orientation. On a Y-scope piston, you'll see a little arrow that indicates the direction that should face the exhaust port. So you need to make sure you're clear of which direction the exhaust port sits on your motor. Then you want to insert your circlip. Now again, you have this little groove here. You want to make sure when you insert the circlip that the open end isn't towards the groove. So take your pliers, force the circlip down inside, and then use your screwdriver to snap it into the groove. Okay. Make sure you look closely that the entire circlip is in the groove. Now, check your orientation. Insert your needle bearing, your wrist pin. Make sure your arrow is pointed towards the exhaust side of the engine. And insert the wrist pin. Into the connecting rod. Make sure it's pushed all the way in. Now you repeat the same process to put the circlip in on this side. Again, checking to make sure that it's completely in the groove, because if the circlips come out later while the engine's running, they'll fall down the side and put a big scratch in your cylinder wall. Ask me how I know that. Okay, now that you have your piston installed, it's time to install the cylinder jug gasket. Now when you look at the gasket, you'll see it goes on in a certain orientation, pretty easy to figure out. But you also notice that the side of the gasket's pretty thin here. If you buy a gasket through the Polaris dealer or some of the higher end gaskets, they have a little bit of a white sealing material on the sides here. If you bought a cheap gasket, it doesn't have anything. So you're going to have to put something in there, otherwise you're likely to get some air leaks. A 2-stroke engine pulls the air-fuel mixture down in through the crankcase and then pushes it up into the cylinder. So if you're getting any kind of an air leak, especially around the base of the cylinder jug, you're going to run lean, you're going to burn a hole in the piston, and you're going to be back right where you started, doing a cylinder bore and putting a new piston in your engine. So you have a couple of options. One is to go with some red ATV sealant. This is a high temperature. When you put it on, it tends to be fairly easy to remove if you later need to remove your cylinder jug. However, the best stuff to use is really the Moto Seal. And you'll see that it says Moto Seal on the package here. This is not the gray ATV, the gray RTV, I should say, sealant. This stuff is made for sealing aluminum halves together. Makes a very tight seal. However, if you need to take your cylinder jug off later, it sticks pretty tight and you pretty much have to use a razor blade to clean it all off. So there's your options. So apply just a thin bead on each side and then go ahead and install your gasket. Okay, let's go ahead and install the cylinder jug. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind on these two-stroke pistons is that in the groove of each piston ring is a little pin. I can show you a close-up picture here so you can see what I'm talking about. Typically they're on the back of the piston. Now the gap in the piston ring fits around those pins, and that keeps the piston ring from moving and rotating around as the engine is running. So you want to make sure those fit around. Take your cylinder jug, fit it down over the piston ring, just kind of work it a little bit and keep your eye on those pins and just press it in, and then just lower cylinder jug onto the studs, and then take your 4 nuts, tighten them down. Now the nuts on the cylinder jug are actually quite tight. They're tighter than the torque specifications for the cylinder head. So go ahead and take your 15mm wrench and snug those up. Before you install the cylinder head, you want to take a clean shop towel, dip it in some 2-stroke oil, and then wipe around the inside of the cylinder, getting it nice and oily to lubricate the engine as you initially start it up. So next step, install your head gasket. Usually there's a little notch here. I put it towards the exhaust side. Grab your cylinder head. And then take your 6 nuts, your 12mm socket with your torque wrench, and tighten them up. The best way to do this is use a little bit of a pattern. Tighten this nut down, then move here, then back over to this nut, then down over here, and finally the last 2. And you want torque just a little bit at a time. Probably go around 2 or 3 times before you'll finally start feeling a pop in this style of torque wrench to indicate that the bolts and the nuts are tight enough. The last step really is to go ahead and put in your spark plug, and you should do a pressure test, or they sometimes call it a leak down test. This is to ensure that the engine is sealed and that you don't have any air leaks. But that's the subject of another video. So for now, you're done.